So let me get started on just some of the high level points that I wanted to make before Dean began. We're talking today about culture eating strategy for breakfast. So let me kick off the presentation by saying simply that I like people. I'm what you would call a people person. And in fact, I need people. And according to Barbara Streisand, that makes me one of the luckiest people in the world. But the fact is that people, a company's employees, are the root cause of 63% of cyber incidents. That's unsustainable. And to protect themselves, organizations need to develop what I call more effective cyber risk cultures. Those are places where every employee, no matter where they sit in an organization, feels a sense of ownership in their organization's cyber risk management process, knows their roles and responsibilities before, during, and after a cyber incident, and takes appropriate action to prevent or mitigate the consequences of a cyber bad day. Why? Because organizations with more effective cyber risk cultures tend to be safer than their peers. We survey hundreds of companies each year on the topic of employee engagement, and how connected your people feel to your business, your mission, can tell you a lot about how productive they are and how long they'll stay with you. And through this research, we've also identified four cultural indicators of higher than average cyber risk. In other words, if you're lacking in any or all of these people focused areas, you have a much higher likelihood of experiencing a breach. And the first is lack of customer focus. So employees in breach companies, they report less emphasis on customers, slower responsiveness to customers, and fewer proactive efforts to gather and act on customer feedback. The second area is poor adaptability. Again, employees in breach companies report that their companies lack both speed and flexibility when it comes to decision making and managing teams. And the third is low empowerment. Employees in breach companies report lower favorable scores when it comes to empowering staff through communications, respect, and support for teamwork. And finally, inadequate training and compensation. Employees in breach companies report less adequate training for the work that they do, specifically less opportunity to learn and advance in role, and a need to better align pay with performance. So, what's the common thread among all these four? They're not what a CISO does all day. These cultural challenges have nothing to do with encryption, firewalls, or other critical technical solutions. Instead, we're talking about the human element. At the end of the day, getting the people piece of cybersecurity right calls for a new way of doing things, a new partnership between CISOs on the one hand and HR leaders on the other. And these leaders must join forces now to address the huge cyber challenge that people present. Unfortunately, we're not off to a great start when it comes to risk culture. Most organizations today are focused on governance strategies that don't have much real impact. Things like quarterly training programs for staff that frankly are more about tick box exercises than actually changing the culture. And changing the culture takes time. Boards and other senior leaders like investing in technical security controls because they often can be correlated to tangible returns. What are the metrics for assessing whether one's culture is changing for the better? They're hard to define, but with 63% of cyber incidents being caused by people, we've got to figure them out. So if we could go to the next slide. Now, I speak a lot on how organizations can go about building more effective cyber risk cultures. And the one thing I've noticed is that event organizers very often want to frame the topic as, humans are the weakest link in cybersecurity. And from my standpoint, that's not very helpful. And to be honest, it misses the point. Your people, if you properly engage them, actually can be huge force multipliers for cybersecurity. And the sad reality is that most organizations treat their people as a problem and not as the risk management partners that they can and really should be. So if you're punishing your workers for failing a phishing campaign and not creating positive incentives that encourage improvement, you're sowing fear. And a fearful workforce is not going to meaningfully engage on even the most compelling awareness and training efforts. But simply, you're not likely to get the buy in you need to change cyber attitudes and behaviors for the better. Now, don't get me wrong, people do present real challenges, but it's a company's obligation to better engage, equip, and empower them. So let me briefly touch on some factors that contribute to people risk and where many organizations are still getting things wrong. The first I want to point out is cognitive bias. These are the mental shortcuts and systemic errors we all make, resulting from the imperfect way we process information and make decisions. So, when it comes to cyber, that means we often do things that have a detrimental effect on ourselves, our teams, and our businesses. Companies need to take cognitive bias into account as they build out their cyber strategies. Now, the second factor, as I mentioned earlier, is a lack of or insufficient cybersecurity training. How can we expect our employees to be an effective human firewall if we don't equip them with necessary skills and knowledge? And how, by the way, do we make training relevant to their personal lives, which is often the key to knowledge retention and putting lessons learned into practice? The third factor, tiredness, boredom, and a lack of concentration. Look, we're all mortal beings. When we're not at our best, we make mistakes. And once again, hackers are all too aware of this human vulnerability and they look to exploit it at every opportunity. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought this reality into sharp relief. Over the past year, the bad guys have deployed an onslaught of emails that purport to advertise coronavirus protection and detection techniques, but which actually deploy ransomware when opened. They also know remote work comes with a slew of family and other personal distractions that contribute to higher email click rates and, by extension, higher rates of cyber infection. So, in considering these points, where are most organizations with their cyber risk cultures today? The bottom line is that they're not doing too well. Most are poorly communicating with their teams about how cyber risk is relevant to the business and what individual employees can do about it. Most organizations haven't made anyone accountable for building a cyber risk culture strategy. Let's be honest, CISOs and HR leaders are generally not coffee clutching on a regular basis and are consequently missing a huge opportunity to collaborate. And most organizations continue to see the human element as simply too hard to tackle. Buying a firewall is easy for business executives to understand. It's a concrete 1 + 1 = 2 return on investment. Investing in people to change their attitudes and behaviors, that sounds kind of touchy feely. But here's the truth, the touchy feely really is where it's at. The most seasoned cybersecurity professionals will tell you that building more effective cyber risk cultures is what's needed if we're ever going to reach a state of true cyber resilience. So, a word to organizations that proudly state that they have a best in class cybersecurity strategy with all the right security technologies in place. Good for you. But if you aren't effectively addressing the human element challenges that I've mentioned, your cultures absolutely will be eating your strategies for breakfast. So before I hand things over to Dean, hopefully, please think about the culture issues that are listed here on the screen. Which apply to you? How are they impacting your business? And what will you do about them?
So yeah, can I first thank Tom for the introduction and the first two slides in terms of setting the scene, talking about business culture as firstly a business issue, but then moving on to that third slide where Tom discussed some of the issues and some of the problems, I suppose, that make us that path of least resistance. Tom talked, of course, about cognitive biases, lack of or insufficient training. Now, what I'm going to do is kind of take that one step further and talk to you about what we as a business look to do to overcome and address some of these problems. Now, of course, and is at the very core of this summit, what we needed to do as a business was better understand our people and our culture, not technology factors within our business. Now, of course, technology security controls attracts a majority of the budgetary investment, of management attention, and the resources for many, if not most, global organizations, and ours included within that. But of course, key to technology operating securely is the human, is that workforce. Now, with over 50,000 colleagues around the world all using and interacting with the cyberspace, effectively sitting at the sharp end of our security defenses, what we wanted to do was try and get them engaged, or at least some of them engaged in cyber to a degree. Now, of course, and we understood that we wouldn't do that by attempting, to continue talking to them about corporate technology. So, and like many of you here today, we do have technology and security teams that deal with cyber, those wonderful but often invisible people who live and breathe security standards, controls frameworks, audit, compliance, and so on. But everyone here knows, of course, that cybersecurity is much bigger than that. And actually, in understanding the culture and that link to cyber, what we needed to do was move away from the technology and focus entirely on the person. And most importantly, I'm talking about their thoughts, their opinions, their perceptions of cybersecurity. So we were looking for human felt responses and not, again, security standard or kind of technology based approaches. At the same time, we also wanted to understand how people felt about the business and the corporate environment more broadly. But of course, the key to doing that as well was doing it in such a way that was engaging and ultimately made them feel like they were making an impact, whilst at the same time, and this really is a reality that we all, I think, have to deal with it in some shape or form within this summit, is that actually cybersecurity is boring. Now, I'm going to make no apologies. That's not the first time I will say that today. But again, it's a reality, and these are, of course, some of the challenges that we as security awareness professionals do need to deal with. As I've said, we are a business of many tens of thousands of people, and Maura's fantastic presentation prior to mine, talked and touched on the difference in languages and the many different cultures at play within the business. Now, for us, getting consistent and actionable insights was, and always will be, I think, a challenge. We were starting from a position of nothing. Now, okay, we had access to click rates, kind of training completion metrics, but all these are true representation of the business and our cyber culture? Actually, I don't think they are. But what we did need was a line in the sand, an initial baseline of measurable metrics to better inform and guide our internal cybersecurity efforts. And most importantly, that needed to be one that placed the people, the workforce, and our culture at its core, and not simply just the technology. So what did we do, and how are we going to understand our cyber culture? And of course, and on the screen, Tom has kind of gone into some of those aspects. Now, firstly, in terms of the who, asking a single and generic set of questions around thoughts and around opinions wasn't likely to work in giving us those actionable insights that we needed. Actually, cyber does and can mean different things to the likes of a CFO when compared to the customer services or the mailroom staff, for example. Now, what we wanted to do was capture and understand the nuances and the differences, within the business. What we did there was ultimately break the company down into 4 key participant groups. On the screen, we can see, firstly, group 1, this was our senior leaders and their executive assistants. Group 2, we determined would be middle and functional management. Now, that's quite a vague term, but actually gave us the flexibility that we needed, to ensure that we were getting the best quality of respondent. Group 3 was our information technology and security teams. But again, going back to an earlier comment, the focus was on engaging with them at that personal level, not talking about technical security standards or controls frameworks, talking to them about their thoughts, their perceptions of cyber within the business. And lastly, and arguably most importantly, is the general workforce. This could be any individual, I guess, of any seniority or level within the business. In terms of you kind of, looking to break your company up into those 4 groups. Again, we felt that this model gave us that flexibility to kind of chop and change however we saw fit. So at this point, moving next on to the what. So we have, as I've said, broken our organization down into 4 parts. What we needed now was to decide what we were going to ask, what was relevant, what was meaningful to our colleagues within each of those 4 groups, making it as personable and as customizable as possible. What did our assessment framework need to look like? Most importantly, what are the areas, within our business and within our culture that might be impacting on cybersecurity? So what we did there, and in the middle, you can see, was effectively build out a framework of 6 key categories. Now, starting with attitudes, we wanted to understand what the individual and collective attitudes towards cybersecurity look like. Now, these could have been affective, behavioral, or cognitive attitudes. Secondly, behaviors. What and how do our behaviors, our actions and activities impact the business? Now, we determined that these behaviors would be categorized as either emotional or habitual behaviors. Thirdly, business norms. How are everyday business norms impacting our people? Are there any organizational, procedural, or social, maybe societal norms that might be placing the business and our people at heightened cyber risk? Next, communications. How effective is communication within the business? Are there any deficiencies? How is it deficient? If so, and what are the issues? Next, responsibilities. Are we responsible both at an individual and at a group level? Do we take cybersecurity seriously within the business? Do we have problems with empowerment, with a duty of care, or with ownership? And how might any of these deficiencies again be impacting the business? And lastly, compliance, everybody's favorite word, I'm sure. But do we, again, as an individual, as a collective group, take any notice of and adhere to an agreed set of procedures or cultural norms? How do we build buy-in to compliance? Could our approach be considered yet another of those kind of tick box governance varieties? Okay, so at this point, we have again broken the company down into 4 groups. We've decided on the categories that would form our assessment framework. Now we needed to decide how we were going to get out to the business. And we would do that with difficulty, I'll be honest. Again, we are an organization of over 50,000 colleagues, and quite simply, we couldn't possibly or conceivably imagine, that we get anywhere near close to engaging with and understanding, thoughts, opinions, perceptions of 50,000 colleagues. However, and to aid with that process, what I did was turn to a very helpful quantification and measurement method, which is commonly referred to as the rule of 5. Now, the rule of 5, it is said that the analysis that of as little as 5 data samples is enough to return a 93.75% chance that a median of a population is between the smallest and the largest values of any kind of random sample. What does that mean? It means, again, we didn't have to go out to 50,000 people. So if I consider our 4 groups with data samples from as little as 5 people, in theory, we could achieve actionable results with just 20 respondents or people engaged with that project. So again, that means we didn't have to sound a huge and vast amounts of surveys. We could look to deliver actionable results, again, based on a much, much smaller sample of data. Okay, moving next to a number of things and items to consider. Firstly, cognitive biases, conscious of time here, Tom has covered these already in detail, but actually in terms of our analysis and our assessment framework, what we wanted to do was kind of structure the questions in such a way that allowed us to better understand where there might have been cognitive biases present within the organization. Now, cognitive biases are very difficult to change, although it is achievable. But most importantly for us, however, was actually just being cognizant, again, of the presence of cognitive biases. And again, that would better inform and guide, with our onward and future conversations around building, effective cybersecurity within the business. Okay, in terms of language barriers, again, with many global territories at play, what we had to do ultimately was turn to communication, so emails, web conferences, Skype calls, and so on, really to build relationships and to start, at least getting the conversation going. Now, again, with an organization of our size, cultural differences are always going to be present. We know that hackers don't really care who or where they target, they just need that first in. So again, as part of the assessment framework phase, we look to consider each of the nuances and the differences in terms of the culture, within our business and within our colleagues more broadly. Okay, point number 3 is really talking about the identification of any client-facing or high-risk functions within the business. Now, you each know your businesses better than I do, of course, but our approach saw us work with cross-functional teams really to discuss and identify any, well, priority, critical, or at-risk parts of the business. Through discussion, it was clear that there were several that were more potentially at risk than others. But if this is a question that you're struggling to answer, we can recommend making use of things like, again, phishing click rates, or any other metrics such as training completion to help possibly guide, where and who to target this culture assessment at. Okay, and moving next on to the questions themselves. Again, the questions really, we were looking to tap into those human factors, asking questions at that personal level. And these needed to be short, concise, and appreciative even of individual role, level of seniority, and part of function within the business. Now, an important part to mention here is gaining support for this kind of project, of course, boiled down to trust. So if we were going to make real change, we needed to ask, in all honesty, some quite uncomfortable questions, looking to get those honest and warts and all responses. So in the initial part, there needs to be a conscious effort to build trust. We did this by guaranteeing anonymity, for those individuals that look to engage with us on this project. Now, what we did was ask no individual within each of our 4 categories any more than 25 questions. Again, keeping this down to no more really than 15 minutes in terms of the engagement and the time that we needed them to provide to us. Again, it needs to be low operational impact, but at the same time, trying our very best to maximize those outcomes. Easier said than done, I appreciate, but on the screen what we have are some samples of the kind of questions that we asked. And now you might notice we try to refrain from overuse of that word cyber. Now, in the context of global events, certainly through this year, I'd like you to maybe take a quick look and consider how these, are directly applicable to organizational cybersecurity moving into 2021. We've talked already about, the increase presence of remote working, but at the same time and at a personal level, individual concerns, worries for their jobs, for their livelihoods, worries and concerns for the safety and well-being of their loved ones, their friends, their families, and so on. So again, I think in understanding this and these human factors, which are often overlooked, granted, I think within cybersecurity, actually, it's in these kind of environments we know that hackers tend to thrive, through fear, through uncertainty. So again, looking to get to the root cause of some of these issues will better inform us in the long run. Okay, in terms of our findings, firstly, we had with the project a 30% engagement rate. Now, do we think that's good? Actually, I was very pleased with that. As an engagement rate. Again, we came from a position of nothing, so we were looking to build out a baseline of understanding, a baseline of knowledge with which to take this as an effort forward. 30% is obviously and clearly more than nothing, so whilst we hope that will increase in time, actually as a starting point we were very, very happy with that. In terms of scoring the responses, there's questions that we asked of our colleagues. Now, on the screen is the framework that we use. Now, there's no hard and fast rule as to which framework. This is one we built because it was easily understood. It allowed us to report our findings up through and to some of the security teams and so on, and actually, ensured that we could keep our reporting outputs consistent. Okay, so what were our biggest problems? Now, you might see on the screen already in terms of those 6 categories and then the 4 reporting groups. Actually, our biggest problem wasn't with attitudes, with behaviors. It was business norms. In particular, a perception, from the workforce that indicated workplace strains and pressures, weren't allowing them to conduct their duties in maybe a safe and secure environment. And again, we know that hackers love to play in that kind of ballpark, where people are fatigued, they're stressed. These guys are right for targeting and perfect for making mistakes, and are, I guess, ultimately more prone to dropping their guard. Again, and like with cognitive biases, changing business norms is difficult to achieve, but at least now we have a starting point. And whilst we maybe not be able to change them, in the short term, certainly on that journey, we are now cognizant of where and how business norms, might be impacting cybersecurity. So we have somewhere to start. Okay, moving on to final thoughts. Again, we'll come very quickly through these, and actually these are messages I'm sure will have kind of been brought up through earlier discussions. Firstly, be positive. Again, we're working with workforces who, for the most part, are likely to think that cybersecurity is a very, very boring subject. So we need to be positive. We need to keep engaged. And we need to make it meaningful. This needs to be a journey again that we try and attempt to get our colleagues on board with. Going hand in hand with that is persistent or persistence even, staying the course. This is a turbulent corner, I suppose, of cybersecurity, and it's one that we come up against, challenges in terms of internal stakeholders in particular. We've had many, many difficult conversations, but it's a worthwhile journey. And of course, it's a subject that we need to keep talking about. Why is that? Well, because we know that the path of least resistance is and will always be the human. So a purely technical approach isn't, and certainly going into the future will not work. Communication, if you can, talk to everybody. Again, bring them along on your journey. Cybersecurity, again, means different things to many different people and teams within the business.
Hey,
But what
Dean,
we've got to do.
I'm so sorry, but we're going to need you to wrap this up in the next minute.
Okay, Lance, again, can I just apologize, for the technical issues. I'd be very happy actually to record and kind of an offline version of this presentation and share with you all. But yeah, there we go. Lance, apologies. Tom, thank you very much. And yeah, thanks for having us.